Good morning. My name is Dr. Kimberly Olson, and before I begin today, I want to ask Father God to grant me the words to be of service and you the courage and fortitude to hear the things that you need to hear. You probably clicked on this video because it's about narcissism, and it's kind of a hot topic right now, and I can completely honor and understand why, because living with a narcissist or having been raised by a narcissist is incredibly painful. So you sort of always knew that you were broken, but you weren't quite sure why, that there was something different, and that you're not sure why altogether that you continue to tolerate the emotional abuse. Maybe you're just becoming aware of it, right? Maybe you were raised in a family where that was perfectly normal, and then you did what most people do, which is you're one parent, you marry the other. Okay. So you ended up in a relationship with a narcissist. Well, it's very easy for us to sort of point the finger, right? And look at what's wrong with him. Maybe I can find out what's wrong with him or her if the narcissist is female. Maybe I can fix it. Maybe there'll just be enough love. I have a family. I don't want my family to be disrupted or destroyed. And 1,000 other lies that we tell ourselves to justify staying in a relationship that's not good for us or for our children. So we're going to start off with a little story, a story that I hope that you can relate to, although the particulars are going to be your own. And then we're going to go back and talk about what is going on inside the codependent, that they continue in this relationship, and how can we find our strength to protect our children from the same outcome that we experienced. Okay. So let me share with you this story. It's a true story. All right, so Brian is a 25-year-old drug addict who attended a local rehab after being kicked out of his mother's house. Brian's childhood was marked by maternal abandonment, just a fancy way of saying his mom split. She ran off with another guy and left him with uncles and aunts, which left him feeling incredibly abandoned and alone. Upon reunification with his mother, Brian was immediately informed that he could only stay until he was 18 years of age. And this is something that Brian experienced as further rejection. So you want me back, you want me to be with you, and I'm being forgiving and gracious, but I only get to stay until I'm 18 and then get the hell out. After being dishonorably discharged from the military, Brian didn't have a whole lot of respect for authority, which you can understand why. He lived with various family members, obviously not his mom, but until the stepfather offered to allow him to move in with his family for a fresh start. So this really intrigued Brian, right? Because not only was he being welcomed back into the home with stepfather and mother, although it certainly wasn't mom's idea, but it looked like a second chance for him. But after 2 months of drinking and little progress in employment, Brian's mother told him that he had to go to rehab or face homelessness. So again, Brian did some what we call sabotaging, right? When we have an outcome that we're familiar with, such as abandonment and rejection, we often inadvertently create it. So in this case, he wasn't doing the things that he needed to do. But he felt very much, again, abandoned and alone, and this time in a new state. So we've got Michelle, who's moved to the area. She got clean and sober prior to the move, but was struggling to fit in high school after her life experiences in recovery. And I'm sure you can sort of understand that. For a 16-year-old to get clean and sober is going to tell you a little bit about what their background was like, and the things that they've endured, and to come to a place where they're already mature enough to be discussing sobriety and doing sobriety is pretty telling. You can definitely see why it would be hard to fit in at high school. So prior to rehab, Michelle had experienced trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and the emotional abuse consistent with having a covertly narcissistic mother. So remember, at the end of the day, when we're talking about a narcissist, it's really all about them. Michelle's mother insisted that she attend traditional high school, despite Michelle noting that she was very alone and didn't fit in. Michelle asked if the family would resume counseling. This is something that had worked at their former residence, but mother told her, you will be out soon enough. So we, dad and mom, need to focus on our marriage. So once again, Michelle was alone, felt abandoned, felt like she didn't have anyone, and again, was in a new area. So dysfunction meets dysfunction on the 12-step campus. So Brian and Michelle meet at 12-step meeting. Brian was smitten with Michelle's appearance and she with his attention. They were no longer alone. So we had these two people who felt very much abandoned and alone and came together. Brian lavished love and attention upon Michelle in a way she had never experienced before. And so if you're a child of a narcissist, you can certainly understand why that would feel incredibly good. In fact, might even be somewhat addictive, right? Somebody's finally paying attention to me. Somebody loves me. Look at all this attention they're bestowing upon me. They had conversations that lasted for hours, and Brian extended exceptional effort to be with Michelle. So this is back in the day of phone booths. Okay, so he'd be out talking with her at 3 o'clock in the morning in phone booths. And again, this kind of lavish attention was really new to Michelle. The relationship became sexual, and it wasn't long afterwards before Brian was unfaithful. Michelle was devastated. Again, finally, somebody loves me. Somebody is able to give me the support and the nurturance that I need. In fact, he really seems to love me, but then he cheated. The effort that Brian once put into the relationship stopped. So Michelle was really confused. How did things change so quickly? I must have done something wrong. Okay, why doesn't he love me like he used to? How come he's no longer, putting in all this extra effort to be with me? So Michelle began blaming herself. It must be something that I'm doing or not doing. I must be disappointing him the same way that I disappointed mom. Brian and Michelle had a baby. Brian left Michelle several times for other women, even right after the baby was born. This crushed Michelle because it felt like the first person who truly understood her abandoned her and rejected her. Okay, but she would always take him back because the agony she felt when he was gone was worse than the pain when he was there. The agony she felt when he was gone was worse than the pain when he was there. So the infidelity, the slights, the no longer putting in a lot of effort into the relationship, that was painful, but it was worse when he was gone. The only thing she could describe it as was agonizing emptiness when he was gone. He was her whole life and he knew it. Okay. So as the two of them had gotten together, both living in a new area, okay, Michelle had made him her whole life. After reunifying, Brian briefly, 2 months, supported the family, but told Michelle that he didn't want to marry her because of how she is. Now, mind you, this was after he had left for a while, came back and loved bombed again, but I wasn't going to put that in yet, but you know what the definition of love bomb is, which is you're giving somebody a bunch of attention and love and way over the top in order to get them hooked. So he didn't want to support the family, okay, because of how she is. And of course, with somebody that poor of low self-esteem, you can completely honor and understand why she assumed it was her fault. So Michelle got her own place and Brian quickly moved in with her. Okay, he needed somewhere to live. She recognized that. Never put together that when he would have affairs and things like that, when things didn't work out, he went back to Michelle, much the same way that a young adult might go back to their parents' house. So the thing that he always needed and wanted, which was this place to always come home to, he had found in Michelle, only Michelle wasn't his mama. Michelle was his girlfriend. Michelle needed him to watch the baby while she went to school. So she went on to college and he needed a place to live. He told her repeatedly that they were friends, but lived together as a family. accepted this explanation, accepted whatever scraps he was willing to give. Just don't leave. Okay. Brian once again abandoned Michelle, this time for a neighbor. Brian was then incarcerated for a time, and Michelle got a new place to live. Okay. So he's incarcerated. He was having an affair with a neighbor, and she moved to a new place. The trade-off. So Brian's new girlfriend was unable to support him, so he began to pursue Michelle again. Okay. Now notice it's never blatant. It didn't just happen like that. It's that he started paying her attention again, and he knew just the right words. He knew just the right things to do to be loving and supportive, the thing that she needed the most. Okay. And she was so amazed that one minute he could be the most loving man in the world, and then in the next minute, the most cruel person she had ever met. Okay. So they could have all this love and affection, be together for years and years. And when he started a relationship with somebody else, he would look at her and with no sorrow, no regret. And in fact, she told me about an instance where she had said, "How could you do this to me?" And he said, "Well, I'm not doing this to you. I'm doing this for me." Okay. That was his explanation. But again, when he needed somewhere to live again, then all of a sudden she was cool. Nevertheless, she was still alone, and the pain and fear she felt without him was greater than the pain she felt with him. So Michelle let him back in. Brian alternately loved and hated his dependency upon Michelle. He loved having a home to return to, but hated that it put him in the child position, right? Because she was paying all the bills. It made him feel powerless. And of course, because there was so much maternal projection onto Michelle, that resentment that he felt towards his own mother and the lack of power he had in that relationship was often projected onto her. So he would reestablish his masculinity and power by being a womanizer. Okay. You don't tell me what to do. You don't have any control over me. And this is how I get my power. Okay. So here's the shit show. Brian was afraid of being alone and being abandoned, and he was alone in a new community with few resources. So that, right, like a magnet. Michelle didn't feel like she fit in, was in a new area, and received maternal rejection when attempting to connect. Remember the whole scenario? She's trying to get counseling again. Brian desperately needed someone. Remember, he had never had that sense that somebody was always going to be there for him or have his back due to rejection by mom. Okay. And he has poor self-esteem because, again, what happens when you're rejected by your own mother? What does that say about your value and your worth? Well, it says that you're not worth a whole lot. And so Brian did what he had to do, which is love bomb, in order to get her hooked in. He showered her with such love and affection until she was hooked. Being dependent on someone was shameful for Brian, and he conducted himself in a way that would typically elicit abandonment. In fact, you can think in terms of, honestly, guys, testing. How much can I do and you'll still take me back? How much shit can I put into your life and you'll still love me? Okay. So when it did not elicit abandonment, behavior was exacerbated. When faced with abandonment, he would quickly return to Michelle. Once Michelle was hooked, remember, she started off empty, right? And so that sense of wholeness, that sense of love, that sense of fulfillment came from one source, and that was Brian. Okay. Her fear of abandonment made her tolerate intolerable behavior. Low self-esteem made her rationalize that she was deserving of such behavior. But the truth is, when I think back to Michelle, she would have tolerated anything. Just don't leave me. Okay. Felt so very much abandoned and alone in the world. And boy, did they have each other's number. He needed security and love, and they were on the merry-go-round. So the more she needed to be secure in him, and the love from him and the stability from him, the more he pulled away. The more he pulled away, the more she chased him. Now, before we conclude the story, I want us to go back and tell you and talk about why all this is happening. Okay. So let me, oops, let's try this again. Let me share again. How come this is all happening? Okay. Well, we had the narcissist. Mine was the narcissist, as you probably figured out. But there are two really specific types of narcissists, okay? You have the grandiose type, which you usually know. They're usually an asshole. You go to dinner with them. They could be at a table with a room full of lawyers, and they're not a lawyer, but they're going to tell them how to do their business, right? They have this incredible need to feel special. They have fantasies of success and power, want to tell other people how to do it, yet they don't have it themselves. They require excessive admiration, right? Without commiserate accomplishments. So what the heck that means is that I want you to treat me like I'm a genius, but there's nothing to really suggest that I'm a genius except my own self analysis. Is exploitative and takes advantage of others. So you can see that in the case of Brian and Michelle. Brian found her vulnerability really quick and exploited it, right? Knew that she needed someone to love her, knew that she needed that type of vision, knew about that fear of abandonment, and absolutely exploited that. And when he was no longer needed, right, disposed of, which narcissists do, okay, would be very, very cruel. So they lack empathy and are willing to identify with the needs of others, right? And by the way, I want to just share with you that when I was working in jails, I can't tell you the number of people that I met who would be very upset and appear to have very strong and powerful emotions. But when you would really talk to them, okay, their sadness was for themselves. They felt sorry for themselves that they were going to face this jail time. But when you'd ask them about the victims, it was a very dismissive kind of attitude, right? So either they deserved it, okay? Well, you know, those rich people, I robbed their house, right? Or just completely dismissive, okay? They tend to be envious of others and believe that others are envious of him or her. So that's a really interesting dynamic, to the extent that if a person says so-and-so is jealous of me, you can almost guarantee what they're talking about is their own experience, right? That they experience intense envy, because when you're okay with yourself, you don't make those assumptions. Shows arrogant, haughty behaviors and attitudes. Well, in the case of Brian, he was obviously not a grandiose narcissist, but a vulnerable narcissist. So grandiose folks are really covert. Again, you're going to look for overt arrogance, entitlement, dominating conversations, overt competitiveness, being uncomfortable when they're not the center of attention, no respect for people's boundaries, they lack empathy, and mistreatment of those below their station or their perceived station. Remember that they think they're special, so I don't know, I've worked with clients that were overtly narcissist who, when I would challenge their thinking, would say things like, well, you know, you're not Dr. Phil. Dr. Phil might understand me. Okay. And in all fairness, maybe Dr. Phil could in a way that I don't, but Dr. Phil doesn't know you the way that I do. Okay. But that was something that worked for them. So they're really good at flipping the script, okay, and challenging you. When in fact you're trying to have a discussion about one of their sort of defects of character that are problematic. Major victim posturing, by the way. So vulnerable narcissists are more difficult to detect. So you want to look for sensitivity. Okay, but that sensitivity is usually to potential criticism, real or fancied. So they're very sensitive to their feelings, their emotions. I was thinking about someone I worked with that had, she had bought a boyfriend a really beautiful necklace, and she was very proud of herself because she didn't have a whole lot of money. And the boyfriend had a really I'm not sure why you got this for me. I'm very uncomfortable that you spent money on this. And of course, the young lady began to cry. And she said, I can't believe that. That's your response to me. And his response to her was that I feel like you're victimizing me by putting me in this position. So it's wow. If somebody disagrees with them, if somebody has a different perspective, and God help you if you have a better station in life than they do, because it's going to be a brick by brick takedown. Okay. There's passive aggressive competitiveness. So the grandiose narcissist is going to be much more overt or upfront about this, right? I have, what did I have one client tell me? Well, I have so many, my training and my background, I have the equivalent of 20 master's degrees, right? He was trying to level, but it's more passive aggressive. Okay, so what a passive aggressive or vulnerable narcissist might do is, let's say you got a new piece of jewelry. Okay, they might look at you and say, oh yeah, that's nice, but it's a little too showy for me. Okay, in all fairness, it might be too showy for that other person, but that's not a response. Okay, that is a leveling response. I'm going to bring you down to my level. Okay, I've seen this where people were dating and oh God, one of my clients, the gentleman said to her that, well, if you looked like Jennifer Aniston, then I'd want to have sex with you all of the time, which of course meant that she didn't measure up. Okay. Triangulating others. We especially see this, by the way, in families where there's a narcissistic parent. Okay. Where you notice that you and your siblings never really sort of get along. Right? There's always this distance between you and your siblings because mother or father is the person that's always pulling the strings, right? They're the one that does the go-between thing where, well, your sister, blah, 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 or your brother, blah, blah, blah. And the siblings never have a chance to have this relationship that just sort of belongs to them. Siblings are supposed to be cohesive in a way that parents aren't involved with. Right? It's supposed to be its own subsystem, but that can't happen because, again, if you're raised by a narcissist, they're always breeding competitiveness between you. If you happen to be watching the show Succession right now, that's a really blatant example of this. Those siblings never had a chance, right? Because they're always going to be competing for Logan. Gaslighting. That's when you are made to feel like you're crazy. Right? Because you're noticing things. So one of the classic examples of this is when, for example, if someone is suspecting that the other is being unfaithful, right? And really because they're just demonstrating symptoms of that, like they're staying out all night, they're very secretive on their phone, very secretive on the internet, things like that. And they say, you're so sensitive. You're just so jealous. I don't know how much longer I can put up with your jealousy, right? When anyone with a half ounce of common sense would be suspicious, right? But no, it's not me, it's you. You're crazy, okay? Self-serving giving, right? Well, look at this beautiful thing that I made for you, except that that's not what you wanted, okay? But look how good I am because I'm giving that. Again, in a lot of narcissistic relationships, we might see some very financially generous gifts. But again, it's not really for that person. It's so everybody else on the outside goes, ooh, look how much your husband loves you. Or look at how good he is to you or how good she is to you. Victim posturing. So they started up, okay? They're the ones that sort of, to quote old Rambo, drew first blood, starting stuff with you, oftentimes being antagonistic, evocative. And then when you react, you're the bad guy. Okay? And that's all anybody else hears about, by the way. Narcissists are really, really good at getting minions, or what they call the flying monkeys, okay? Where they turn everybody against you or attempt to turn everybody against you because they're only getting one side of the story. And it doesn't matter, by the way, if this is family or mutual friends or the very people that you go to for your own nurturing, okay? They're going to go after them. Okay, so what's a codependent? This is a person that feels responsible to solve other people's problems. Okay. And there really is sort of a secondary piece to this. Remember the emptiness we were talking about with Michelle? Okay. If I solve other people's problems, then maybe you won't leave. I mean, there's secondary gain. There's no murders in this dance. Okay. They struggle with identity outside of a relational context. So I've certainly worked with people that if I want to find out how they're doing, all I need to do is ask how their spouse is doing, right? Because they don't have any sense of identity independent of that. They're constantly monitoring their spouse. Let's say their spouse is an alcoholic. They're trying all these tricks to get them to stop drinking, to get them to behave differently. And of course, they think they're doing a good thing. But what they're really trying to do is control and manipulate a situation, okay? Because this situation is scary to them. This situation is painful to them. But as opposed to sort of asserting yourself and saying, you know what, you have the right to live the way that you're going to live, but I'm not going to live that way. Instead, I'm going to try and control you into doing things my way. They tend to feel very used and underappreciated. Lots and lots of martyr posture to the extent that everything I've done for you, how many times I've taken you back. So if you talk to Michelle, oh my gosh, look at how many times I took you back after everything that I've done for you. And yet you still don't appreciate me. I try to control others, again, for their own good. So remember, looking back at Michelle and her side of the story, is that I need Brian to behave because I need the security of you. They hold others accountable for their happiness. So if you were to ask Michelle how she's doing, it would depend on how she and Brian were doing. And of course, preoccupied with the behavior of others. So I was reluctant to add this because there is such a just shitty stereotype of borderline personality disorder, which is completely unfair. And when you have extreme examples, you're talking about people who are very manipulative, can be kind of scary, right? But all of this stuff sort of exists on a spectrum, okay? And so what I find with a lot of my codependent folk is that they have some borderline features, in particular, chronic feelings of emptiness. So remember back to the story, Michelle walked into this relationship with chronic feelings of emptiness already, did not feel full in and of herself, did not feel she was enough, did not feel she had anything, which of course made her incredibly vulnerable to the narcissist. Rapidly shifting intense emotions. Okay, so they're real sensitive about any signs or indications that you might be rejecting or abandoning them, even if what you've said, might not trigger anybody else to feel that way. So they will do things also that sort of elicit that because of the rage they feel when they feel like they're going to be abandoned. Because again, this isn't some boyfriend or girlfriend leaving you, okay? This is their entire world leaving them. And the anxiety and the tension. And again, they become their own worst enemy. I remember working with someone who her boyfriend had cheated on her. And she went outside of the restaurant that he was working at and carried like a picket sign saying that your cook probably has AIDS because he's cheating on his girlfriend. Now, she felt quite self-righteous in doing this, right? Because he had cheated on her, she was in pain, so she felt very justified in doing this. Well, of course, that elicited the exact response she was afraid of, which was abandonment. Of course, he never wanted to talk to her or see her again. Relationships are tense and unstable. When borderlines first hook up with folks, it tends to be amazing sex and very intense. They can be very reckless. They get into self-harm and suicide attempts sometimes. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, there's a lot of differences, but there's also a lot of shared traits. So let's look at shared traits first. These are both shame-based disorders. So I want you to think about Brian, right? He comes from a place of shame. Mother abandoned him. When he came back into the picture, he felt further abandonment. Michelle comes from a place of feeling unloved, unwanted, and alone. And all of those things are very shame-based. And shame, when you think about it, is sort of the most fundamental and core to who we are and what moves us, right? It originates in the family of origin. Look in the background of the narcissist for a lack of parental empathy. So when Brian's mother took off, she certainly wasn't empathizing for him. She was looking out for number one and doing what she wanted to do, right? Placing the children's needs below their own. Neglect, whether that's emotional neglect, physical neglect. I've worked with families where the mother is dressed nicely, but the kids aren't. Okay. Abuse, and again, especially shame-based degradation, right? So there's something wrong with you. Okay, so when you look at sort of their internal thoughts, it comes down to the sense of my everything or nothing, which can help you see why they're so damned competitive, right? It isn't that we all fall on the spectrum. It is, I am everything or I am nothing, right? So when you meet somebody and you have narcissistic tendencies, you're constantly sort of looking them over and assessing, right? Are they better than me or are they below me, right? And again, this is not conscious. You're not running around with a tally sheet. But it is due to this idea that I was always nothing. And I found that I have a sense of self-esteem when I am everything. So I'm super sensitive to that. Borderlines have poor parental boundaries, okay? Often with borderlines, we see parentification, triangulation, especially of the variety where, let's say there's an alcoholic parent in the home. And the oldest daughter and father, let's say the mom's the alcoholic, become very close, right? Because mom's emotionally unavailable. And of course, the further you are in your alcoholism, the less becoming your personality truly is. But instead of the narcissistic mother sort of looking at herself, she blames the daughter for this, right? And so there's a lot of shame and confusion. Look for substance abuse. Narcissistic parent, again, they tend to be very tricky. Inconsistent treatment. A competitive parent, and you're usually only going to see that again based on these really bizarre passive aggressive remarks. I had a client who once told me that she got all A's, on her report card from college. And she told her mother, and her mother said, well, you always were so competitive with me. And of course, those grades had nothing to do with her, but it evoked a sense of shame in that person for being successful. Okay. We see vacillations between rage over perceived abandonment and shame over their responses. So here's a key difference between the borderline and the narcissist. So again, they both come from shame. They're both shame-based disorders, but the borderline feels like total shit afterwards. Okay. Have you ever had a chance to see that film? It's called Fatal Attraction. And I'm talking about the one that was made in the 80s. I don't know about the new one. But Glenn Close plays this character called Alex. And there's a scene in there where Alex is clicking this light. She's sitting on the floor, kind of in sort of a phased dissociative kind of state, and clicking the light off and on and off and on, right? And the lights are on, baby, but nobody is home in that moment. She is in such a state of anguish and shame, she can't even stay present. They'll do a lot of things that are very abusive to themselves. Again, that might be a time where they cut, where they binge eat, maybe they go out and drink, right? But again, it's this shame. And the rage comes from knowing you're being screwed over, right? But narcissists are so good at making it seem like it's something about you, okay, that the person gets confused. They buy into the gaslighting. And again, if you don't have a really great self-esteem to begin with, you can see how easy this is. Okay, so we go back to, and I won't stay here, how clusters are created. Okay, we talked about Brian and Michelle. Their two worlds collide. And then the baby makes 3. And the trade-off, right? And then we look at the shit show, how this all came to be. You can see how his dynamics dovetail her dynamics. He needs to remain in control. He needs a place that he can always go where he will be wanted and loved, right? So Michelle fits that mold. Michelle needs to feel loved and valued and not alone. So he fits that mold. And so here it is. He needs security. She needs love. And on the merry-go-round we go. Well, I didn't want to leave it like this, right? Because it makes it seem so helpless, and it really isn't hopeless. And in fact, we've got a lot going on with children in this case that I need to share with you that might surprise you. Well, there's resolution, okay? Brian left the community for a time, and Michelle met somebody else. Michelle was able to have security with her husband, and eventually Brian met someone else as well. Okay. Michelle ensured that her daughter had visits with Brian and his family, although it continued to be Michelle that initiated this contact. And she did so, of course, for the sake of her child, because she didn't want her child to experience the same feelings of abandonment that she experienced. And so, okay, so Michelle's with a good guy. They're moving on with their lives, and Brian meets somebody cool, and they all lived happily ever after, right? And so Michelle can just kind of chalk this up to having been a bad relationship. I made my way out of it, and I made my way through it, and we're to the other side. Wrong. So wrong. What Michelle didn't realize is many, many things, but their child continued to have contact. But again, it was almost always initiated by Michelle. Years later, Michelle found out that Brian had molested their daughter, something their daughter only remembered as an adult. As these memories came flooding back for this child, she remembered her father saying to her, "Don't say anything to mom. We don't want to worry mom." Okay. The child was really young when all this was happening. Okay. The child stated that when she was going to tell Michelle, just because she thought it was something that felt good, that Brian grabbed her by the arm, and the child still has pain in her shoulder from that. Okay. This molestation went on off and on for years. And as certain as you are that your spouse doesn't have the capacity for this, was as certain as Michelle was that Brian didn't have the capacity for that. In fact, Michelle initially strongly doubted this. Okay, she knew Brian was a womanizer, but never imagined he could ever do anything like this to his own child. He protesteth too much, right? This explained, though, a lot of their child's behavior. They were never understood before because she didn't display the typical symptoms of an incest survivor. So Brian was no dummy. And in the grooming process, right, he made sure that a lot of the red flags that would typically stick child as being molested were not present. Okay. So for example, children who've been molested will often masturbate. And of course, boundaries were clearly set about that kind of thing. So it didn't give all of these sort of red flag appearances. However, Michelle in hindsight sees some things. Michelle recalled their daughter having been marked in her private area, but the child and Brian said it was due to riding her bicycle. Okay. Now, hindsight is always 20/20, right? It could have happened by virtue of the bicycle, but as Michelle was looking back now, right, she thought, "Wait, how could you be so stupid? That didn't come from a bike." Okay. Brian stopped having sex with Michelle many years ago. But Michelle assumed it was because she was undesirable. She thought it was all about her. She thought he was out womanizing and carousing so much that he wasn't having sex with her because he no longer found her desirable. Brian was a sex addict. And what a sex addict is essentially is someone who is addicted to the rush, right? And of course, with any addiction, tolerance builds. And in order to get the same high, the acts need to be more novel and forbidden to get the same results. And I only bring this to your attention is that we got a hell of a lot of people who are now addicted to porn. Okay. And when you're addicted to something, resisting temptation is something else. Things that you would have never dreamt of doing, okay, become all of a sudden in your purview. Okay. Brian had discussed his deviant desires with Michelle. In fact, Michelle had shared with me that he did a lot of phone sex kind of stuff. But he always said, I don't do shit and I don't do kids, which actually reinforced Michelle's belief that he couldn't be a pedophile. Right? He's going to be open and admit to being a womanizer, being into S&M and all that kind of stuff. Then, of course, he's not a pedophile. And then finally, it hit Michelle that she was a child when she met Brian, just 16 years old when she met Brian. Okay. So what was he attracted to and drawn to? Probably because it was forbidden. Okay. Probably because a 16-year-old's not going to know any better. A 16-year-old's not going to be hip to the game. Is not going to be hip to his excuses. Doesn't know enough yet to be frightened of somebody who's chronically unemployed, right? Because a 16-year-old's still being cared by their parents, right? So they're not going to see a big picture. And Brian's new wife actually was 20 years his junior as well. So the cycle keeps rolling. So I want to talk to you about the lies that we tell ourselves. It's okay for me to hurt as long as he doesn't hurt the children, right? I cannot tell you the number of women, including Michelle, who truly think the only person that's being hurt is them, that they are willing to withstand. In fact, they're kind of like martyrish about it. I'm willing to withstand this for the betterment for my children. Bullshit. You're staying because you're afraid of being abandoned. And your kids do not want to be your reason or your excuse for staying in abuse. You're staying because you're afraid. Okay. And the behavior that you're teaching those children is to tolerate abuse. That's it, right? You want to model for who your kids are going to marry. They are one parent and they marry the other. They don't care what you say, right? I hear parents will tell me all the time, well, I tell them that's not right. I tell them that's not the way to do it. They learn from your example. Children learn from example. They don't give a shit what words are flying out of your mouth. They're learning from your example about what you tolerate. And do you honestly think it's better to live in a broken home than be from one? Okay, at least if you're from a broken home, your other parent has shown you how to get out, how to survive, how to start again, and how not to be at the mercy of a narcissist. Okay? And it's not hurting anyone but me. You're wrong. Parents are our models of what to expect. You can't expect them to do anything but what you have shown them. So finally, as in the case of Michelle, sometimes you have no idea how bad it really is until it's too late. And in that whole time, when you were sitting back and thinking that it was you that was victimized, it was your child being victimized. Okay. And this is an extreme example, but this is no different than if you have a husband who's always putting your children down. Okay. I'm staying because, financially we need it, blah, blah, blah. Really? You need your kids to feel like they're a piece of garbage because their dad constantly tells them they are, because he can't take the competition. You want your children to be divided by a parent who is drawing conflicts between you and competitiveness. Or, oh, my personal favorite, Maybe you've heard this cliche that the greatest gift you can give to your children is the example of a marriage. Guys, the greatest gift you might be able to show your children is the example of a healthy marriage. You don't use this line to justify your spouse continuing to abuse your children, okay? So what do we owe our children? Protection, not only from physical and sexual abuse, but from emotional abuse. Watching you being emotionally abused is abuse, okay? If you want your children to be strong and overcome difficulties, you must show them how it's done. Because our children learn from our examples, not our words. And get help. Get the help you need to overcome this situation. It's clear if you're married to a narcissist that he or she has probably alienated you entirely from your friend base and your family. But guess what? The people who love you, they're still there. Okay. And the bottom line is there's nothing more expensive than regret. And you can't pretend that you don't know anymore, that you don't know that staying in this situation is harming your children. And maybe your comeback is, well, that's really great for you to say, Dr. Olson, but we're going to be in poverty forever. Better to be in poverty and everybody to have their integrity, okay, than selling the self-esteem and self-respect of your children to a narcissistic spouse. So I wanted to end with this slide. It is absolutely possible to get off the merry-go-round. Okay? It's going to take courage. It's going to take time. It's going to take you challenging every belief, every negative thought, every challenging of your competence and your confidence to get out of there. But if you can't do it for you yet, do it for your children at this point, okay? Because we can't afford to continue to watch the videos about the illustrious narcissist and how bad they are and try and figure them out and try to do these things to sort of compensate. You can't do that anymore. You have knowledge now. You have knowledge that choosing to stay and choosing to place your child in that position is damaging. You know better now. And guess what, folks? We get so much further in life by focusing on ourselves and what we can change about ourselves than we ever will. You're probably going to need a therapist that's going to help you work through this abandonment, because that abandonment is real. That core level, if I don't have my spouse, I'm nothing. That's real. That anxiety, that panic, it's real. And you're going to need somebody, you're going to need a lot of somebodies to help you and love you through it. And even if you're extremely frightened, okay, we got to love our children more than we fear abandonment. I know you're not going to get to that place tomorrow. I don't expect you to get to that place next week, but I will share with you that I will support you. You have access to my email. Send me an email. I will support you on your journey, right? But I think it's a much better use of time to focus on what we can do to change ourselves than to continue to talk as much shit about the narcissist as we can. Okay, it's not getting us anywhere, although it's very informative, right? And leaves us feeling sort of very self-righteous and sanctimonious, right? We have the problem if we're involved with that. All right, guys, I'm praying for you, praying for me, and I hope that this moved you, that it got your attention, and that you were able to hear whatever it is that God needed you to hear. And I hope that my words reflected what I was supposed to convey to you. And I'm sending you love and support. Thanks. Bye-bye.